So I've called my sermon today Faith, Healing and Ecological Wholeness. So it's a reflection on Bartimaeus and Job. So in our Old Testament and Gospel readings, both Bartimaeus and Job are affirmed as exemplars of faith. The beggar Bartimaeus is healed of his blindness, and Jesus tells him that it is his faith that has made him well. Bartimaeus' vision is contrasted with the blindness of Jesus' disciples. The encounter occurs just outside Jericho, the last town on the journey of Jesus and his disciples from Galilee to Jerusalem. 3 times on this journey, Jesus has told his disciples that he will suffer and be rejected, and they fail to understand. And you might remember from the Mark reading from last week, Jesus asked James and John, "What do you want me to do for you?" So exactly the same question as Jesus asked Bartimaeus. James and John want status and privilege. They are blind to Jesus' purpose and values. But Bartimaeus wants to see again, and it's important too that he names Jesus son of David. So he's recognizing him as the Messiah. Bartimaeus wants to see again. And unlike the rich man in the reading from a fortnight ago, you might remember the rich man was unable to respond to the invitation to follow Jesus, to give away all his possessions, sell what he has, and to follow Jesus. In contrast, Bartimaeus doesn't wait to be asked. With no need of his cloak anymore, which is his tool of the trade as a beggar, which he would have received money and food and so on, he throws that away and follows Jesus on the way. So in this encounter at Jericho, we see Mark at his subversive best. So a blind beggar, an excluded person, destitute, unclean, and let's face it, annoying, because he makes a fuss, doesn't he, is a paragon of faith. So we'd expect nothing less from Mark, would we? This is typical Mark. How about Job? So I want to first say that Job is a difficult and complex work that's been returned to again as a deep reflection on suffering. At the end of this book of Job, God commends Job for his faithfulness and for speaking truthfully. Unlike Job's 3 friends, which are very hard names to pronounce, calamity after calamity was visited upon Job, and Job's an upright man. His children, farm workers, and livestock have all been killed, and he's afflicted with terrible illness. In his suffering, Job cursed himself and cursed God. And against a dominant theology that's voiced by the 3 friends that saw suffering as a punishment for wrongdoing, so it's a theology that blames the victim, that says that suffering is retribution for wrongdoing, Job has protested his innocence and demanded an explanation from God. Ultimately, no explanation is forthcoming. But in this final chapter, God commends Job for his faithfulness. And there are divergent interpretations as to what it is exactly that Job is being commended for here. For Old Testament theologian David Penchansky, he argues strongly that God is commending Job not for his prostration before God at the start of chapter 42 that we heard today, not for that, but for Job's earlier rejection of the principle of retribution. And it's because of this contrast between Job himself and the 3 friends, that's directly the contrast that God makes in that passage. So if we follow this interpretation, then what we see here is a parallel to the story of Bartimaeus, where Jesus refuses also to victimize a blind beggar, an excluded person. He includes rather than excludes. Both Bartimaeus and Job are affirmed as exemplars of faith. Both also experience healing or restoration. For Bartimaeus, it's the restoration of his sight. It's a new vocation and purpose and inclusion in the Jesus community. As for Job, again, there's a lot in the conclusion to this great book that is Job, this book on suffering that's perplexing and uncomfortable. God can appear as capricious, as treating Job like a plaything, having allowed Satan to afflict Job for the sake of a wager, God now restores Job to health and prosperity and blesses him once again with children and long years. And what's more, the contrast between Job's excessive wealth and the itinerant way of life to which Jesus calls his disciples, and Jesus' repeated condemnation of individual wealth, is also jarring here. Nevertheless, a healing it is, and with some striking elements in a patriarchal society. So the daughters are named here, but not the sons. And the daughters receive an equal inheritance to the sons. And I should also say as well that there are actually Marxist readings of the book of Job. I haven't read them yet, but I've got one in my bag if you want to have a look after the service. Which is important in a context when you're talking about wealth and excessive wealth, right? But what about creation? So I've spoken something of faith and something of healing. But what about larger creation in all of this? Because I want to reflect on these scriptures ecologically. And I think there's an interpretive key, an interpretive idea in this that's helpful for us to do it. And that is the principle of voice. And this principle is very often used in ecological readings of scripture. So the reader looks for the voice of earth in the text to see whether earth, or other than humankind, of other kind, has some kind of agency, some kind of role in the story, or whether earth is simply passive, a stage for where the real action happens, or a passive object on which others inflict their will. And closely related to the principle of voice is the principle of resistance, where earth and her components actively resist injustice. And by the way, there's a series of books called the Earth Bible series which use this principle. There's about, I think, 8 volumes now. The earlier volumes of the Earth Bible series looked at particular passages through an ecological lens. The later books of the series look at particular biblical books in their entirety. So there's a new one just come out on Numbers, an ecological reading of the book of Numbers from Anthony Rees, who's a lecturer in Old Testament at the United Theological College. So the principle of voice is important in ecological readings. I don't think that other kind, other than humankind, has an obvious voice in either of these texts today. But what I do think is that attending to the voice and agency of both Bartimaeus and Job can nevertheless open us up to other voices that we might not usually hear. So what do I mean by that? Both Bartimaeus and Job refuse to accept their lot. Beggars are uncomfortable, and Bartimaeus makes a royal fuss. When people tell him to be quiet, he turns up the volume even further. Bartimaeus is the agent of his own healing. His faith that he could indeed be healed by Jesus has made him well. And this is classic liberation theology. The person at the margins, or the community at the margins, is the agent of their own liberation. But of course, we need to recognise the dangers in all this. There's always a risk of blaming people with disabilities for having insufficient faith to be miraculously healed. There's also a danger to pathologise disability as a problem for the disabled individual. So we must always return to the voices of those who live with disabilities. And Shane Clifton, who's a Pentecostal theologian who lives here in Sydney, is one such voice. Supernatural healing, he says, is rare and miraculous, but injury, suffering and disability are a part of life. In one way or another, and at some time or other, we are all disabled. We are all subject to embodied limits. The focus then shouldn't be on supernatural healing events, but on Jesus' radical inclusion of those who are excluded and on the fullness of life within limits. So the social model of disability might have been a term that you've heard, which understands disability not as an individual pathology, but as social structures and practices that exclude the disabled and prevent them from fullness of life, is important here. Shane, who is a quadriplegic, writes, "I've not had any spectacular or miraculous healing, notwithstanding prayer from thousands of people around the world, as well as the laying on of hands by people with reputations for a healing gift." And quite humorously, he talks about, being at charismatic healing concerts and being like this elephant in the room, like his wheelchair's really high, and everyone can see him there, as the unhealed person. He then says, but in the face of embodied limits that once seemed insurmountable, I have since been transformed by an outpouring of love from family and friends, by prayer that ministered grace and established hope, by acts of charity that funded rehabilitation and made my home accessible, by a spirit-filled workplace that went out of its way to accommodate my needs and yet treated me as a scholar and not a cripple, by providential encouragements in the many times that I was down, and as I have been helped to flourish within the limits of a spinal cord injury, the community supporting me has also been transformed and enriched. So not a supernatural healing event, but a slow healing for Shane, but also for the larger community. So what's this got to do with ecology? And this is where I think the testimony of someone like Shane is important, not only in a Pentecostal context, but for all of us. Because whatever wholeness and flourishing look like in this world, it must necessarily include limitation and death. To make space for the other, for the poor, future generations, for Indigenous peoples, for other creatures, requires by necessity limitation of how much of the earth's space we take up, and of course ultimately our own passing. The Uniting Church Statement, Economy of Life, puts it like this: the Christian vision of wholeness is not about perfection, physical or spiritual, or freedom from disaster or suffering, is not confined to the world to come, but is offered as a reality for the life of this world. It's a vision of flourishing, abundant life, of peace and reconciliation, justice and transformation, love and inclusion for all creation. Love and inclusion for all creation, so not just responsibility and not just stewardship, but love and inclusion from the margin. The statement goes on to describe the antithesis of this vision in the biblical stories. The world of idols, of which mammon, which is wealth gain or possessions, is prominent, and separation and exclusion from community, often wrought by violent and oppressive social, political and religious systems. It's clear that mammon is strongly implicated in the inertia in our society to addressing climate change and other ecological challenges. And there's an opportunity for you at the end of November, 29th of November, to call for another way and to join our brothers and sisters from the Pacific at the People's Climate March. Brothers and sisters from the Pacific are taking a particular lead. So, I don't want to turn my sermon into an announcement, so I'll tell you more about it over supper. So we've talked about Bartimaeus' voice, Bartimaeus' agency. What about Job's voice, Job's agency? Job protested against his suffering to his three friends and later to God. He repeatedly rejected the charge that he must have deserved his own suffering. But it appears that ultimately the only agency that Job has is either to protest it or to submit to what's happened to him. Affliction, and then later, finally, restoration are visited upon him without explanation. And this is the way of the world, we could say. In between his protests and his acceptance and restoration, in chapters 38 to 41, we have what's called the divine speeches. Do you know that part of Job? It's where God speaks to Job from the whirlwind. It's amazing prose, 4 chapters of it, where God says, who are you to question what I do? Do you know the workings of the world? Do you provide for all of these creatures? And so on. In some interpretations, in this part of Job, God has bullied Job into submission. And we heard Job's response there of prostration from the start of chapter 42. If I follow this interpretation, I cannot help but parallel the plight of Job with the many marginalised voices that have been suppressed. The forest silenced, the species lost, the voices, human and other kind, that have been pushed to the margins of society. And yet I don't think we can simply dismiss the divine speeches. In that central part of the book, There's a radical decentering of Job from the story. The divine speeches are expansive and magnificent, prose about the workings of creation and God's provision for a myriad of other kind. So voices in creation abound in this part of Job. Singing morning stars, seas that burst forth, wise ibis, roaming wild donkeys, soaring hawks, the unrestrainable leviathan, and more. This really has nothing to do with Job, and it's beyond his comprehension and control. Job is so overcome by his feelings of smallness and thinks of what consequence is my suffering in all of this, that at the end, he says, I take it back. He says that in the world, when he has seen God with his own eyes and he repents of his self-centeredness, he has seen God with his own eyes. His understanding of Yahweh has changed. But at the end of the book, of course, we once again see a re-centering of Job to the story and the restoration of his fortunes and so on. Once again, the action focuses on Job. However uncomfortable it all is, this movement of decentering and re-centering is fundamental to us finding a home in a flourishing world. Attending to other voices in creation, whether they be blind beggars, our sisters and brothers in the Torres Strait or Tuvalu, endangered ecological communities, traditional owners, is inevitably a decentering experience. Seeing ourselves as marginal to the enormous story of life, but once again finding and claiming a place in it is, I believe, key to the kind of social change that's needed for inclusion of all creation. And for those of you who would like to spend some time in an intentional Christian community that will form around exploring what does ecological discipleship look like as a Christian community, there's opportunities coming up for you to do that on the Mid-North Coast next year. So again, before I turn my sermon into an announcement, I'll talk to you about that over supper. I want to say as well that as a young adult, over 10 years ago, I was tremendously privileged to encounter what was then called UCATSA, now Christian Students Uniting. And so I haven't visited here at this church before, but there's a connection that I have with all of you. And at that time, I heard Jesus' call to me in inspiring and uncomfortable ways, and to stand here and look at that up there, is uncomfortable. Discipleship for me never has been and never will be separate from questions of ecology. And I'm here this evening not because I like preaching. So, preaching is a huge responsibility. And not easy. I'm not here because I like preaching, but fundamentally because I want to offer encouragement and support to you. And I want to offer Uniting Earth Ministries encouragement and support to you. As a community of younger people here in Leichhardt, it is difficult to explore these questions, and it's a lifelong journey for me. And if there are ways that I and Uniting Earth Ministry can explore you, I can support you, in looking at this in whatever small or larger ways that you might feel called to, even to encourage you and to pray for you, which I do, I would love to talk with you more about that. And finally, to draw a connection back to my home church in South Sydney, I'd like to invite you to take part this evening in a tradition that we have at my church at the end of each sermon. We call it Completing the Homily Together. Members of the congregation are invited to have a voice by responding to one or more questions after the sermon. So whoever feels led is able to come and briefly take the floor in response to one or more questions that the preacher poses to them. And so my questions to those of you who would like to answer tonight are, where have you heard a voice from the margins in creation? And how have you felt called to respond? So again, where have you heard a voice from the margins in creation? And how have you felt called to respond? Just answer the first part if you like, or both parts. And over to you.